Welcome to the 32nd annual lecture series. My name is Doane Nelson. I'm a resident of Lincoln, Nebraska. And as I signed in tonight, because Andrea and I were at the Holland Center a week ago, could not join you, I signed it as one of the original winter lecture series fossils, because I think I've helped put the series together over a series of decades, willingly and lovingly. First of all, rule number one is please silence or destroy your electronic gadgets. And I'm also the enforcer, so if they go off inadvertently, I will be collecting them from you, and you can retrieve them out in the parking lot underneath my vehicle. The Winter Lecture Series is sponsored by the Social Action Committee of the Unitarian Church, the Humanities Nebraska organization, and the acronym OLLI is the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. The format is as follows. We have a lecture for approximately 1 hour. We break for 10 to 15 minutes. We have questions and answers after that. We end at 9 p.m. sharp. Some of you may have an opportunity to stay later than that to visit. This is a death by 1,000 paper cuts. No good deed goes unpunished. I'm not going to repeat anything I've already said. I'm going to give you 3 email addresses here in the next 90 seconds. So if you've got something to write with, it all relates to this series and the mechanics of the series. The refreshments provided are free during the break, but any contributions are not only accepted, but encouraged, and they'll be used in the future to help fund the lecture series. Here comes address number 1. In future years, if you would like to receive announcements of the Winter Lecture Series by email, you may send an email to, and here we go, R as in Romeo, D as in Delta, I as in India, E as in Echo, N as in November, at neb.rr.com, with winter, the season winter, in the subject line. If you're currently receiving mailings through the regular mail, please send such an email instead so that our postage costs can be controlled. If you're not on that mailing list but believe you might be interested in the future lecture series, please send that email. If bad weather events seem to threaten the need to cancel a lecture or have one, you can find out any updated information, and the website is this Unitarian Church at www.unitarianlincoln.org. Free parking in the lot across the street from our parking lot. Dr. Mark Orzag is here visiting from Doane College, Doane University in Crete, Nebraska. By prior agreement, I've cast my introduction of him so it doesn't appear to you that he is deceased. I can tell you that his achievements in academia, in his various higher education organizational affiliations, as well as the institutions he served on their faculties, has been first rate. Within our overall seasonal theme of national identity and the politics of nationalism, Dr. Orzag will address Europe. He started his academic career at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, where he majored in history. He then went on to Penn State University and was awarded a master's in Russian history. His doctorate is from Michigan State University in European history with honors. you can see that he has a very outstanding background. He's been on the faculty at Doane since 1998. For those of you who are so inclined, in addition to his academic expertise, he speaks Russian and French. So there's a whole wealth of subjects that he's familiar with that you might want to raise during the question and answer, as well as follow up with him. Mark?
Good evening to all of you. I'm very honored to be here. I'm kind of taking on a rather broad and complicated topic tonight. And I intentionally geared this in a way to try to cover as much ground as I can, and at the same time make it kind of engaging. I'm really looking forward to the question and answer period, and I've crafted it in a way to, I think, to try to evoke some questions. So just briefly, kind of looking at what we have. Obviously, there's a sort of revival of nationalism currently in Europe. And it's a broad and confusing topic because you can talk about European nationalism, but then I think if you look at it more closely, you quickly realize that there are a number of different currents, a number of different threads, a number of different types of nationalism. And we'll be kind of breaking some of those down tonight. And then obviously the major issue with nationalism today, obviously that nationalism is in many instances in opposition, in whole or in part, to the European Union, the 28-nation bloc. Now, I think, and again, I was just talking with Dr. Forsyth before the lecture, and we both agreed that there are really two EUs. There's an economic EU, this single economic space, and then there's also this emerging superstate. When the EU was first created, there was this idea that you're going to have this United States of Europe. I would agree with Dr. Forsyth that the second part of this project, the so-called emerging superstate, is today in a shambles, and that there is a lot of resistance to it in Europe along nationalist lines. The economic part is, I wouldn't say necessarily vibrant, but I would say more viable at the moment, in part because there would be real consequences to getting out of it. And sort of there where we'll start, because one major European country, Great Britain, is thinking about getting out of the EU, both in terms of the superstate and in terms of the single economic space. Essentially a complete exit from the EU, known as a Brexit, British exit. So essentially, will this happen? It's never happened before. But right now, just showing you how currently this topic is, you've had David Cameron in negotiations with the Germans and other powers within the EU to figure out a way to try to keep Britain in the EU. But it is a complicated process. And let's go ahead and roll that first video of David Cameron talking about the deal that he reached with the EU. Of course, the first time it came right on. Didn't get the advertisement. There we go.
Tells exactly what we've agreed and why. I began this
Yeah, that's fine.
nation to address.
If people are on Wi-Fi right now, you might want to shut your Wi-Fi phones off because we're all sharing the same pipe right now.
Concerns of the British people. And today, all 28 member states have signed up to concrete reforms in each of the 4 areas that I set out. British jobs and British business all depend on being able to trade with Europe on a level playing field. So our first aim in these negotiations was to get new protections for countries like ours, which are in the single market, but not in the euro. Let me take you through what we've secured. We have permanently protected the pound and our right to keep it. For the first time, the EU has explicitly acknowledged that it has more than one currency. Responsibility for supervising the financial stability of the UK remains in the hands of the Bank of England, so we continue to keep our taxpayers and our savers safe. We've ensured that British taxpayers will never be made to bail out countries We've ensured that the UK's economic interests are protected. We've made sure that the Eurozone cannot act as a bloc to undermine the integrity of the free trade single market. And we've guaranteed that British business will never face any discrimination for being outside the Eurozone. For example, our financial services firms can never be forced to relocate inside the Eurozone if they want to trade in euros, just because they're based in the UK. And not only are these rules set out in a legally binding agreement, we've also agreed that should the UK or another non-Euro member state fear that the rules are being broken, they can activate an emergency safeguard unilaterally to ensure that these rules are enforced. Let me be clear, because there has been debate about this, Britain will have the power to pull this lever on our own. Our second aim in these negotiations was to make Europe more competitive, so we create jobs and make British families more financially secure. We've secured a declaration outlining a number of commitments in this area. For the first time, the European Union will now say that competitiveness is, and I quote, an essential objective of the Union. This is important because it goes to the very heart of what Europe should be about. It means Europe will complete the single market in services. This will make it easier for service-based companies, like IT firms, to trade in Europe. Nowhere will this be more of an opportunity than in the United Kingdom, where thousands of service companies make up 2/3 of our whole economy. It could add up to 2% to our economy each year. That is a real improvement. The European Union will also complete the single market in capital. This will mean UK startups will be able to access more sources of finance for their business, and it will also present new opportunities for the UK financial services industry. Europe will now also complete the single market in energy. This will allow more suppliers into the UK energy market, lowering bills and increasing investment across the continent. That is a real improvement too. In addition, we've secured commitments from Europe to complete trade and investment agreements with the fastest growing and most dynamic economies around the world, including the USA, Japan and China, as well as our Commonwealth allies, India, New Zealand and Australia. These deals could add billions of pounds and thousands of jobs to our economy every year. And because I know that one of the biggest frustrations with Europe, especially for small businesses, is red tape and bureaucracy, we've also got Europe to introduce targets to cut the total burden of EU regulation on business. That means that from now on, the cost of EU red tape will be going down and not up. Our third aim in these negotiations was to reduce the very high level of migration from within the EU by preventing the abuse of free movement and preventing our welfare system from acting as a magnet for people to come to our country. In this respect, we've secured the following. First, new powers against criminals from other countries, including powers to stop them coming to Britain in the first place and powers to deport them if they're already here. Longer re-entry bans for fraudsters and people who collude in sham marriages. An end to the ridiculous situation where EU nationals can avoid British immigration rules when bringing their families from outside the EU. We've also secured a breakthrough agreement for Britain to reduce the unnatural draw that our benefit system exerts across Europe. We've already made sure that EU migrants cannot claim the new unemployment benefit, universal credit, while looking for work. And those coming from the EU who haven't found work within 6 months can now be required to leave. Today we've established a new emergency brake so that EU migrants will have to wait 4 years until they have full access to our benefits. This finally puts an end to the idea that people can come to our country and get something for nothing. The European Commission has said unambiguously that Britain already qualifies to use this mechanism, and it won't be some short-term fix. Once activated, this break will be in place for a full 7 years. We've also agreed that EU migrants working in Britain can no longer send child benefit home at UK rates. These changes will apply first to new claimants, and after intense negotiations, we've ensured that they will apply to existing claimants from the start of 2020. I came here to end the practice of sending child benefit overseas at UK rates, both for current and for future claimants, and I've got them both. Our fourth aim in these negotiations was to protect our country from further European political integration and increase powers for our national parliament. Ever since we joined, Europe has been on the path to something called ever closer union. It means a political union. We've never liked it, we've never wanted it, and today we've permanently carved Britain out of it, so we can never be forced into political integration with the rest of Europe.
Okay, we
The
can go ahead
text
and
of
fill
the
it now.
legally binding agreement today sets out in full the UK's position.
Okay, so we can go back to the document at this point. All right, thanks. Okay, so basically he's saying the superstate is dead. We're not going to do it. All right, we're not going to do it. Now, a lot of the other stuff that he has in here, I mean, it's your typical sort of mainstream nationalism, globalist, sounds very moderate. But at the same time, essentially, he is carving out a definite separate space for Britain. And I would say this is sort of mild Euroscepticism. This is essentially some sense that, well, we're not going to leave the EU, the economic part. We like that, or at least we don't want to be kept outside it because we want market access. But at the same time, essentially, the idea is we're not going the whole way down the road because we think that we British have our own way of doing things that is better. And again, there's different currents of nationalism. David Cameron, the dominant politician in Great Britain at the moment, basically is arguing for sort of mainstream, moderate nationalism, somewhat revisionist toward the initial aims of the EU. Now, what will happen? Because essentially he's scheduled a referendum on this for June. And the question now is, what is Britain going to do? And right now, the polling on this is dead even. I mean, they're basically, it could go either way. Boris Johnson, the mayor of London, who is probably the second most popular politician in Great Britain after David Cameron, another conservative. The Labour Party and the left in Europe generally is moribund. I mean, just moribund. But essentially, he, however, has taken a somewhat more populist approach, decrying, for example, well, you've made it so that people coming from places like Romania, very poor Eastern European countries, can't come in here and get on our welfare system. But what you haven't done is controlled our borders so they can't come here and compete with our working class and our lower middle class for jobs. So his message is somewhat more of a populist version, though still mainstream. But he is going to argue for a Brexit, for a break with the EU. Now, this is one strain of nationalism, and quite a moderate one. We're going to go into some ones that are much more radical as we kind of go down the list here. But essentially, the EU has become an issue in and of itself as to whether or not countries want to remain in it, at least in terms of the actual superstructure, as opposed to the economic space. But I also wouldn't predict the EU is about to fall apart. I think there's been a lot of that, and people look at the EU and say nationalism is going to render it asunder. And I think that's frankly overstated. There are a lot of limits on nationalists. There are legal measures against nationalists that are deemed extreme. There are incitement laws in a number of European countries. Nationalist politicians or their parties can be fined. People can be put in jail. So essentially, there's more limits than you would have, say, in the United States. Donald Trump, obviously, for example, who I think would fit into this spectrum in many ways that we're going to talk about, said, you know, we're going to ban Muslims from entering the United States. That would be deemed in many European countries incitement, and that's hence why in Great Britain, for example, there was debate in the British Parliament about whether to ban Donald Trump from Britain. In the end, they decided not to do it. They said a lot of mean things about him in Parliament. He was called a wazzock, among other things. Some classic British 90s slang. But in the end, he was not banned from Britain. But essentially, you have economic realities, i.e., I mean, imagine, for example, the Czech Republic, right? If the Czech Republic suddenly decided it wanted out of the EU, what's it going to do economically? I mean, it's surrounded by EU countries. I mean, that's a really nightmarish scenario in an economic sense, that everybody's going to be tariffing you, and then everyone else has a free economic space around you. That's not a good deal, right? So, and there are also still a lot of Europeans. There still is this idealism. Boy, it's been strained. They've had some of the same middle class squeeze there that we've had here over the last couple decades. They've had generally fairly stagnant economies on the whole. I don't think there's as much of a reserve of goodwill as there once was, but there still is that sense that we need the EU because we fought too many wars in the past, and if we don't have something like this, we could fall into this again. This is also, I think, a timely conversation to have because we're having a very, very different electoral year in the United States. You are seeing things presented both on the left and right and gaining some traction, particularly with Bernie Sanders on the left and Donald Trump on the right. It was a tough day for Sanders on Saturday. But essentially, a socialist, a democratic socialist actually being competitive for a nomination, at least he was. I'm not so sure going forward. But essentially, certainly no democratic socialist has ever gotten this level of support in the United States before. On the other hand, if Sanders is too radical for the United States, he'd be a very mainstream socialist left-wing figure in Europe. At the same time, Donald Trump, and we could say less noisily some of the other Republicans, would fit into the spectrum of other nationalists that we're going to talk about. People who, in the big European countries, haven't taken power yet. But if you look at some of the smaller, poorer Eastern European countries, these types of nationalists are the governments today. So essentially we have this spectrum of nationalists, and in many ways we are seeing some of the same kinds of patterns begin to be replicated in the United States as well. So I think this makes this a very timely topic. Go ahead and scroll that up a little bit. Okay. So we've seen that one, and I'm going to hold off on that for a minute. Go ahead and keep scrolling there. Okay. So now we come to the second video that I want you to see, and this is a brief history of the French National Front. So go ahead and scroll that one. And now you have
the Goldman Sachs 10,000 small
nativist form of nationalism, and we'll see if you think this sounds like anybody currently on the U.S. political scene.
A clamé qu'il voulait reprendre en main les rênes de son destin.
Marine Le Pen, leader of the National Front, speaking after the 2014 European elections when the anti-EU party picked up nearly a quarter of votes in France.
Nous voulons être maîtres chez nous, voilà. Et les Autrichiens veulent être maîtres en Autriche, les Français maîtres en France, les Belges maîtres en Belgique, et c'est tout à fait légitime.
Known simply as Marine to the people of France, she took over leadership of the far-right party in 2011, a mantle she inherited from her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, the fiery populist who brought the National Front to prominence. Since then, Marine has pushed to distance the party from her father's extreme rhetoric and recast it as a voter-friendly option for people frustrated with France's direction and traditional parties. Jean-Marie Le Pen helped found the National Front in 1972, uniting a number of smaller nationalist movements at the time.
Le comité du Front National m'a demandé à l'unanimité d'être dans ce grand débat le porte-parole et le porte-drapeau de la droite sociale, populaire et nationale.
In those days, Le Pen wore an eye patch after losing his left eye following an illness. He quickly became known for his heated anti-immigration rhetoric, calls for increased French birth rates, and the creation of a professional army. It would be 10 years before quote, the hour that changed everything, as Le Pen referred to it, when for the first time he was interviewed on primetime television. Mainstream parties in France had moved to the centre ground, and following his TV appearance, the National Front found itself able to make political deals without having to soften its hardline position on key issues. But in 1987, Le Pen made a remark that would cast a shadow over him for the rest of his career. During an interview on French radio, he said that the use of gas chambers was just, quote, a detail in the history of World War II.
Je suis un passionné aussi par l'histoire de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Je me pose un certain nombre de questions et je ne dis pas que les chambres à gaz n'ont pas existé. Je n'ai pas pu moi-même en voir, je n'ai pas étudié spécialement la question, mais je crois que c'est un point de détail de l'histoire de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale.
Thousands gathered in protest outside the National Assembly in Paris, including Holocaust survivors wearing old concentration camp uniforms. Le Pen said he was being targeted by the media.
Cela justifie-t-il le procès de sorcier que l'on me fait dans la presse écrite, parlée et télévisée?
In the early 90s, the creation of the European Union promised a future that Le Pen rejected. The National Front, by now, was campaigning on an anti-Islamism platform. And when a Moroccan immigrant was killed by skinhead supporters of the party, Le Pen defended the contentious policy that immigrants be sent back to their home countries.
Je considère que mon pays n'a pas besoin d'immigrés, qu'il en a trop, et que tout doit être fait pour que les Français gardent leur spécificité, gardent leur autonomie, leur indépendance, leur souveraineté. Et je crois que le phénomène d'immigration met en péril l'équilibre de nos sociétés, et même leur existence.
By 1997, the National Front was the third strongest political party in France, but that was about to change. During the general election campaign that year, Le Pen visited the crime-plagued Paris suburb of Mantes-la-Jolie, where his eldest daughter, Marie-Caroline, was a candidate for the French Parliament. The protest organisation SCALP, or Absolutely Anti-Le Pen, turned out in force. Le Pen refused to be put
Moi,
off.
je suis un homme libre, dans un pays libre, je me promène librement. Voilà. Et ceux qui veulent m'en empêcher, eh bien, je les pousse un peu. Voilà.
The protesters pursued Le Pen and around 30 of his supporters around town. Then, amongst the scuffles, Le Pen assaulted socialist candidate Annette Paulvast-Bouger. He was fined, given a 3-month suspended prison sentence, and banned from political life for 2 years. He remained defiant.
J'ai été la victime d'un véritable guet-apens politico-médiatique.
But the National Front was fracturing. In January 1999, a breakaway group led by Bruno Maigret founded the National Republican Movement. It tore the party in half. The National Front went into the new millennium with its lowest polling numbers in more than a decade. In 2002, Le Pen made a dramatic comeback. He became the first ever far-right candidate in a presidential runoff, campaigning for tough law and order policies and the death penalty. His campaign included a visit to Argenteuil, a poor suburb with a large immigrant population.
Je n'oublierai pas vos problèmes et j'y remédierai. Tous vous ont promis la lune et regardez là où ils vous ont mené. Moi, je tiendrai mes promesses car je suis un homme d'honneur.
But his dismissive remarks about the Holocaust continued, and widespread anti-Le Pen protests were commonplace. Chirac won the presidential election with 82.2% of the vote, and with 71% of those votes, according to polls, cast simply to block Le Pen. In 2011, 82-year-old Le Pen finally stepped down as leader of the party he founded nearly 40 years ago.
Vive la France! Vive le Front National!
A day later, his daughter Marie was elected party leader.
Vive le Front National! Vive la République! Vive la France!
A year later, in 2012, following the local elections, the National Front returned to Parliament.
Avec 25 ans d'absence illégitime et antidémocratique au Parlement, malgré son incontestable représentativité durant toutes ces années, Le mouvement national fait à nouveau son entrée à l'Assemblée.
In June 2015, a year after the party's success in the European elections, the National Front brought together 7 European parties to form Europe of Nations and Freedoms. The new far-right bloc says it will use its collective voice to fight against mass immigration and defend national interest, culture and identity, principles that the group believes have been undermined by the European Union.
Okay, so back to the document. So that right at the end there are some interesting things, because what you have is you have nationalists, particularly nativist, anti-immigration nationalists, actually starting to organize internationally within the EU, which is a really odd and contradictory phenomenon. But it's starting to happen. We're going to talk about Pegida, the German anti-immigrant movement, in a bit, and that's also happening with that movement. So essentially, what is going on with the National Front now? And in the wake of the recent Paris terrorist attacks, there was an election, and in the first round of that election, they actually carried 6 of the 13 electoral districts within France. But in the second round, what happened is the two mainstream political parties, the Socialists and the Republicans, essentially collaborated. The Socialists just withdrew their candidates from a number of areas that were essentially threatened by the National Front, and the Socialist voters voted for the Conservative Republicans. And so in the end, the National Front carried 0 of the 13 French electoral districts. Now, they've got a presidential election scheduled for 2017. Right now, because she's so well known in France, Marine Le Pen is polling pretty well. By the way, she kicked her dad out of the party at one point too. So, but she's trying to make it more moderate, more mainstream. But as you can see, it's still very nativist. It's still very anti-immigrant. It's still widely deemed by a lot of French who do not support it as deeply racist, and that is not going to change. So essentially, that tag will still, at least in my estimate, probably keep it from a mainstream electoral success in France. That if they couldn't take advantage of this terrorist attack with all the potential politically that had for them, when are they going to be able to take advantage of it? And the answer seems to be they're probably not. That they'll remain on force, but they'll still remain on the margins. Back to Britain for a second, because again, the British case also shows how many different types of nationalism you have. That authoritarian, by the way, that's a mistake by me. That shouldn't be there. Nativist, separatist, mainstream revisionist. We've covered the mainstream revisionist already. Go ahead and rule that up if you would. And then, of course, Britain also is dealing with nationalist separatism, which is the case of Scotland. In 2014, the Scots tried essentially to secede from Great Britain. That lost 55% to 45%. But since then, the Scottish National Party has surged and really dominates Scotland politically. And a lot of the leaders of the Scottish National Party seem to be itching for some excuse to run a second referendum at some point in the future. They couldn't really get away with it now, but there's some of them talking even 2017, 2018. Then, to show you how complicated some of these issues can get, right? What about if there's a Brexit? What if Britain votes to leave the EU? At this point, the Scottish National Party's position is, if Britain votes itself out of the EU, we will immediately have another referendum, because we would effectively be forced out of the EU against our will. So if there's a Brexit vote in June, then the Scots will have yet another referendum saying essentially we want to stay in the EU. A lot of people have speculated that a lot of the Scots nationalists, therefore, will vote for a Brexit, hoping to trigger another referendum. And it again shows how tangled these different nationalist threads can get. Then there was the unique little case of the National Party in Great Britain. And again, go ahead and scroll up again if you would. The National Party is kind of the British version of the National Front, very anti-immigrant, That's sort of its main animating issue. Anti-Islam, arguing against what they call Islamification in Great Britain. And also some cultural issues. Economic globalization is questioned, gay marriage, and multiculturalism. And in 2008 and 2009, during the depth of the recession, it actually had a lot of local electoral success. Won a number of local elections, really seemed to be a rising force. Seemed like it would maybe become a kind of permanent nationalist force, the way the National Front has for decades in France. Its origins went all the way back to some earlier groups in the 70s. But essentially, by 2015, it completely collapsed. Essentially, its leader, Nick Griffin, had to basically resign in disgrace. It got hardly any votes at all in 2015. And this, again, there's certain historical analogies here, or historical patterns. Nationalist groups, if they are seen as extreme in Britain, don't prosper, right? At least not for very long. I mean, the British Union of Fascists in the 30s under Sir Oswald Mosley never really did much electorally. And if you look at France in the same time period with groups like Action Française that were real threats to take power, the British Union of Fascists never was. Today, the National Front is a force. I don't think it'll take power in France despite French problems economically. But in Britain, brief, the worst time of the recession, and then boom, gone again. So essentially, the British case seems to be a more complicated one for nationalists, but at the same time, in some sense, the conservative government there, in its mild Euroscepticism, kind of takes up some of that space politically. Let's go ahead and roll on to the next one, which is Poland. And the Polish Law and Justice Party. And I've labeled this authoritarian nationalism, kind of statist nationalism. And this is a case where the nationalists have taken power. They are the ruling party, the really dominant political party in Poland. They're anti-corruption, they're statists, they're very close to the Catholic Church. They are in favor of economic interventionism, right? Essentially, in many ways, the right, particularly in the poorer Eastern European countries, has taken up that political space that we often associate with the left, right? The statist trying to sort of tone down some of the harsher effects of capitalism, particularly globalist capitalism, and essentially also some of these same conservative cultural patterns. The Law and Justice Party is against gay rights, and it's also, familiar theme by now, against the bureaucracy that the EU imposes, both in a sort of cultural and economic sense. Anti-immigration rhetoric, but since there aren't a whole lot of people that want to immigrate to these poorer Eastern European countries, they all want to go to Germany, it's not as big an issue. But essentially it does have anti-immigrant rhetoric as well. The current dispute between the Law and Justice Party, which was founded by the Kaczynski twins, Yaroslav and Lech, in 2001. Lech later died in a plane crash, but Yaroslav, even though he isn't the formal head of the party anymore or of government, he's still basically the kind of force behind the throne. But essentially there's a major dispute with the EU now over this media law that the Law and Justice Party has passed, essentially creating state-controlled, state-dominated media. They fired the heads of public radio and television and essentially allowed the government, particularly the Treasury Department, to appoint their replacements. And the EU basically says it's undemocratic, it's impermissible, and Poland has basically told them that we're not listening to you. So essentially here you have this kind of traditionalist, statist, authoritarian nationalism. You have something very similar. Go ahead and scroll up again if you would. You have something very similar in Hungary with Fidesz, and this is the Hungarian Civic Alliance, and this is the dominant political party in Hungary. Huge majority, dominant in the media, dominant in electoral politics. Its origins trace back to 1988, when it actually was founded as kind of a leftist libertarian party. But after some electoral failures, it transformed itself into this conservative, sort of statist, authoritarian party. It had some ups and downs early on. It was in power, out of power, but eventually its main opponent, the Hungarian socialists, were really discredited by a series of economic scandals and other scandals. There were some major riots. And eventually, the Fidesz took power in 2009 and continues to hold it today. Again, familiar things. Statist and interventionist in an economic sense, defense of traditional culture, opposition to gay marriage, and like the Law and Justice Party in Poland, trying to basically eliminate checks and balances in politics. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, is widely referred to in a lot of European circles as an authoritarian, and I've heard the word dictator used. Essentially, he is has accumulated a lot of power in his hands, and again, eliminated checks and balances in the courts, politics, and media. And he's another one that's really prickly about the sovereignty of Hungary. And he has been willing to just essentially say, no, we're not accepting criticism from the United States, we're not accepting criticism from the EU, we're going our own way. One of the things that he's doing now that really has a lot of people in the EU and the US scheme is he's basically blatantly violating the sanctions against Russia. He's just not paying any attention to it. Just went and met Putin in a very friendly way the other week. And essentially, again, he's saying, look, we have some very lucrative deals with the Russians and we're going to stick with them. He doesn't openly say we're violating the sanctions, but it's essentially common knowledge, really, that he is and that Hungary is. So again, you have this very authoritarian, dominant political party that's basically telling the EU in a number of ways, essentially, to go to hell. Not in power, but a rising political force the last couple of years is the Pegida movement in Germany. Also very nativist. Again, some pretty familiar themes. This stands for Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamification of the West. And obviously this group has gained a lot of recognition in recent days for opposing Syrian, Afghan, Libyan refugees coming to Germany. And of course, what did the Hungarians do about that? They built a wall to keep them out of there. That might sound familiar to some of you. So essentially, Pegida is more of a street movement at this point, has not become that political yet, though it's trying to. And in fact, this is another one of these right-wing groups that has moved outside of Germany. It's set up branches in Austria, in Britain, sort of the internationalization of nativist nationalism, which sounds weird and contradictory. But again, you see there's so many different threads right now in Europe. This is anti-immigration, but it's really specifically anti-Islamic immigration. And it attempts essentially through often rather violent street demonstrations. There was one more video, and I was going to play it, but we just don't have time, of them attacking a bus. That they're bringing Syrian refugees into Germany, Syrian and others in the Middle East. And again, their offshoots have been set up in Austria, Great Britain, and Czech Republic. They also have taken advantage of some recent events, such as the mass sexual assaults that occurred apparently by refugees in the German city of Cologne. And actually, apparently these occurred in some other cities as well, but most egregiously in Cologne. And they've accused Angela Merkel's government of basically trying to cover up the scale of this. Merkel, who is certainly a no-nonsense person, really cracked down, has suppressed some of their, broken up some of their the demonstrations, and some of the Pegida leaders have been arrested. Spokesman, who was one of the major leaders, is going on trial in April for incitement, essentially calling Syrian refugees trash and cattle. Using that kind of language in Germany is illegal. That is seen as, sort of neo-Nazi type rhetoric. They're centered in East Germany, most notably in Saxony, and they actually appropriate a lot of the slogans. We are the people, for example, something they shout again and again and again when confronting the refugees from the 1989 revolt against the GDR. Again, little political role so far, but that might change. Another one, here's another sort of classic separatist movement, Catalonia, Catalan independence. This one, go ahead and scroll it, has really very deep historical roots going all the way back to the 17th century. Around the time of the Spanish Civil War, there was also a lot of Catalan nationalist agitation. In 2006, there was an autonomy, not independence yet, but an autonomy referendum in Catalonia. Got 74% of the population of Catalonia, the Catalonian region, voted for autonomy. But in 2010, the Spanish Supreme Court said nope, and struck down a number of provisions of that relating to the Catalan language, and also this sort of separate banking system that the Catalans had tried to set up. In the wake of the Spanish Supreme Court decision, which struck down a lot of the autonomy provisions, there were massive protests in Barcelona. About 1.5 million people, by most estimates, participated in those. But the Catalans have been very strict about saying, essentially, we're going to do this peacefully. We're going to try to do it legally. 2015, in a somewhat tight vote in the Catalan Regional Parliament, 72 to 63, they did pass a vote initiating the independence process, again stressing that this was going to be legal and peaceful. But the Spanish Supreme Court, which has not shown any tolerance for this kind of thing in the past, has said, no, we're going to take that up too. You may well guess what the result of that's going to be. That they're probably essentially, again, going to turn it down, and then the question is, what now happens? Do the Catalans sort of try to take this to the streets and put more pressure on the Spanish government, or do they back off? And at this point, again, this is classic separatism in many ways. And again, very complex issues, cases inside and outside the EU, as we've seen, can kind of pit different strains of nationalism against one another. You have the Scottish separatists, and then the whole Brexit issue, fascinatingly, in Great Britain. And then, obviously, major country, not in the EU, so I didn't want to kind of give it its own category, but you have some interesting things going on now with Russia and nationalists there. You kind of have the sort of official nationalism, which I would describe as kind of great power revanchist, i.e. Russia was wronged in the 1990s and was weak and we were taken advantage of, and now we're strong and we're going to set this to rights. At the same time, you have various other strains of nationalism, monarchists, pan-Slavists, and nativists. And it's interesting that the government, and you could also call this great power revanchism kind of Putinism, also strong authoritarian component. It is not nativist. Putin does not essentially scapegoat immigrants. He doesn't use racist rhetoric against immigrants. It's oddly enough, the other side, right, is people like Alexei Navalny, who's backed by the United States and the EU, who is the one that calls Tajik immigrants, for example, cockroaches. So you have this very odd clash of very different sorts of nationalist strains with one another in a number of countries in the EU and also outside it. What's going to happen? Right? And this is obviously really hard to see, because obviously Europe has a number of problems. It's also got major demographic problems. It has, for a long time, had a fairly stagnant economy across most of the continent. You had even some of the major European countries like France, Italy, burdened with probably unmanageable debt, and never mind Greece, and let's just not even talk about them. So you have all these long-term problems. Are nationalists really going to be able to take power? And again, that's hard to predict. I mean, it's hard to right now even predict which way the Brexit will go. If Britain does leave, will this have a knock-on effect? Will other countries at this point start seriously thinking about maybe trying to get out? Or is the case of Britain, because it's an island, because it's always had its own currency, is that somehow unique and it won't have much of a rest of the effect on the EU? And there's still other countries in the Balkans, for example, that are trying to get into the EU. And so that, it may actually end up expanding rather than contracting. At the same time, I think, obviously, the sort of integration part of this, in a non-economic sense, really does seem to be in a shambles, really does seem to be having major problems. If that part isn't going to work, ultimately, what will the effect be on the economic 28-nation sphere that's there? Is that going to be sustainable over the long term? What I guess I would predict is that I think ultimately the EU probably will survive, but perhaps not in a form that we would necessarily recognize. Essentially, it will turn into something rather amorphous. You go back to that opening video with David Cameron. What does this sound like, right? It sounds like nothing but an economic space. Nothing essentially but a free trade bloc. And even there with a number of restrictions, with a number of caveats. And if the British can go in there and sort of renegotiate this, who's to say that the Germans, who have even more economic leverage within the EU, can't at some point go back in and negotiate a whole lot of different conditions for themselves? Where does that process end? So essentially, there are certain trends, there are certain realities that would cause nations to want to stay in the EU, at least as in terms of economic space. But there are also a lot of other trends, essentially, where people are going to want to, countries are going to stay in the EU only on their own terms. And you also have, in these smaller, poorer countries, ones that, kind of slip below the radar, ones that probably nobody living outside those countries cares much about particularly. There, you're already having people who essentially are defying the EU, who are clearly very nationalist in a way that does not fit well with the overall EU structure. So essentially, what is the future of the EU? And I would say cloudy. Not necessarily terminal, but cloudy. So I think that's where I'll go ahead and end it. And certainly nationalism is a major component in that cloudy future.